My name is Nicole Warren, and the story I have chosen is The Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin. Knowing that Mrs. Mallard was afflicted with a heart trouble, great care was taken to break to her as gently as possible the news of her husband's death. It was her sister Josephine who told her, in broken sentences, veiled hints that revealed half concealing. Her husband's best friend Richards was there too, near her. It was he who had been in the newspaper office when intelligence of the railroad disaster was received, with Bentley Mallard's name leading the list of killed. He had only taken time to assure himself of its truth by a second telegram, and had hastened to forestall any less careful, less tender a friend in bearing the sad message. She did not hear the story as many women have heard the same, with paralyzing inability to accept its significance. She wept at once, with sudden wild abandonment in her sister's arms. When the storm of grief had spent itself, she went away to her room alone. She would have no one follow her. There stood, facing the open window, a comfortable, roomy armchair. Into this she sank, pressed down by a physical exhaustion that haunted her body and seemed to reach into her soul. She could see the open square from her house, and tops of trees that were all up-quiver with new spring life. A delicious breath of rain was in the air. In the streets below a peddler was crying his wares. The notes of a distant song which someone was singing reached her faintly, and countless sparrows were twittering in the eaves. There were patches of blue sky showing here and there through the clouds that met and piled one upon the other in the west facing of her window. She sat with her head thrown back on the cushion of the chair, quite motionless, except that a sob came up into her throat and shook her, as a child who had cried itself to sleep continues to sob in its dreams. She was young, with a fair, calm face, whose lines bespoke repression and even a certain strength. But now there was a dull stare in her eyes, as they glazed over and were fixed away off yonder on one of those patches of blue sky. It was not a glance of reflection, but rather indicated a suspension of intelligent thought. There was something coming to her, yet she was waiting for it fearfully. What was it? She did not know. It was too subtle and elusive to name, but she felt it creeping out of the sky, reaching towards her through the sounds, the scents, the color that filled the air. Now her bosom rose and fell tumultuously. She was beginning to recognize this thing that was approaching to possess her, and she was striving to beat it back with her own will, as powerless as her two white, slender hands would have been. When she abandoned herself, a little whispered word escaped her slightly parted lips, and she said it over and over under her breath. Free, free, free. The vacant stare and the look of terror that followed it went from her eyes. They stayed keen and bright. Her pulses beat fast, and the coursing blood warmed and relaxed every inch of her body. She did not even stop to ask if it were not monstrous joy that held her. A clear, exalted perception enabled her to dismiss the suggestion as trivial. She knew that she would weep again when she saw the kind, tender hands folded in death, the face that had never looked save with love upon her, fixed and gray and dead. But she saw beyond that bitter moment to a long procession of years to come that would bring her absolutely and belong to her absolutely, and she opened and spread her arms out to them in welcome. There would be no one to live for during those coming years. She would live for herself. There would be no powerful will bending hers in that blinding persistence with which men and women believe they have the right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. A kind intention or a cruel intention made the act seem no less a crime as she looked upon it in that brief moment of illumination. And yet she loved him sometimes. Often she had not, but what did it matter? What could love, the unsolved mystery, count for in the face of this possession, the self-assertion which she suddenly recognized as the strongest impulse of her being? Free, body and soul free. Josephine was kneeling before the closed door, with her lips to the keyhole, imploring for admission. "Louise, open the door! I beg you, open the door! You will make yourself ill." "What are you doing, Louise? For heaven's sake, open the door." "Go away. I will not make myself ill." No, she was drinking in the very elixir of life through that open window. Her fancy was running riot along those days ahead of her. Spring days and summer days and all sorts of days that would be her own. She breathed a quick prayer that life might be long. It was only yesterday that she had thought with a shudder that life might be long. She rose at length and opened the door to her sister's importunities. There was a feverish triumph in her eyes, and she carried herself unwittingly like a goddess of victory. She clasped her sister's waist, and together they descended the stairs. Richard stood waiting for them at the bottom. Someone was opening the front door with a latchkey. It was Brently Mallard, who entered, a little travel-stained, composedly carrying his gripsack and umbrella. He had been far away from the scene of the accident and did not even know that there had been one. He stood amazed at Josephine's piercing cry, at Richard's quick motion to screen him from the view of his wife. When the doctors came, they said she had disease. She had died of the heart disease, of a joy that kills. Unfamiliar words in this selection were forestall, gripsack, yonder, and importunities. Forestall is to prevent or intercept. Gripsack was a traveling bag seemingly popular in 1875 to about 1880. Yonder is pertaining to that which is over there or more distant. And importunities is a state or quality of being persistent in solicitation. Seemingly the story is told by a first-person narrator who presents the reader with the opportunity to watch an excerpt from the life of a young stranger. The author of this short story was born in an era in which women have little legal rights or freedoms. In this story, the author seems to ask women of her generation to explore the ideal that freedom comes by living for oneself. Likewise, Chopin includes an underlying theme that women should not live for their spouses, while she alludes that marriage is restricting. Interestingly, in this story, the main character, Louise, does realize her freedom, as she is informed that she is a widow and perhaps only achieves true freedom in leaving her husband through death. Historically speaking, this story was written in April of 1894 and was first published in Vogue that very December, under the title The Dream of an Hour. Additionally, this piece seems to lend to the reader that the setting was 1800 America, particularly during an era that utilized the telegram as its primary source of communication. In summation, this story is a brief insight into a short period of time in Louise Mallard's life, a seemingly frail woman who, the reader is informed, is afflicted with a heart ailment. As the story unfolds, the narrator introduces Richard, who is at the newspaper office and learns his friend and the husband of Louise has been listed as killed. After confirming this tragic news via telegram, he rushes to the new widow's house to gently inform her of her husband's accidental demise. Next, the author takes the reader through an emotional insight on how Louise feels upon hearing the news. Interestingly, the ideal of freedom is now introduced as a prevalent emotion through this young woman's grief. Without question, it is my opinion that the climax obviously is portrayed as Louise descends the stairs on her sister's arm, only to have her husband walk through the door in time for her untimely death. How I feel the story relates to my life. Over the last 18 years, I have been married to my college sweetheart, and yet I have spent endless months as a geographic bachelorette. As the wife of a soldier, there has always been additional stresses in our marriage. Consequently, there have been times when I could identify with the main character as she faces the idea that the confines of marriage can be daunting and sometimes oppressive, not only for myself but for my husband. Additionally, as Louise repeats free, 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 I was personally transported to the many times I have stood in the airport or on tarmacs holding an infant or a toddler and smiling brightly as my husband went off for deployments. And sometimes in the back of my mind, I did feel that little voice, free, free, free. Because even though I knew that as time passed, I would suffer the pain of missing my husband, and even though I always looked forward to the day he returned, sometimes that being alone and that freedom is something to look forward to. The end.